The unseen foundation. The night air in New York was crisp, carrying the hum of a city that never truly slept. In the heart of Manhattan stood the Monroe Regent, a five-star hotel known for its breathtaking luxury, world-class service, and most importantly, its ability to generate enormous profits. Nathaniel Monroe, the hotel's enigmatic owner, was rarely seen within its walls. At 44, he was a self-made multimillionaire, a man who had spent the last 2 decades expanding his hospitality empire. His life was dictated by numbers, efficiency, and unrelenting ambition. He saw his business as a machine, one that had to be tuned with precision. Every detail, from the floral arrangements in the lobby to the temperature of the spa pools, was an investment that needed to yield maximum returns. That evening, Nathaniel did something he hadn't done in years. He decided to visit the Monroe Regent unannounced. His chauffeur pulled up to the grand entrance, and as he stepped out, his sharp eyes scanned the towering hotel. The golden glow of chandeliers spilled onto the ornate marble floors, and a doorman dressed in a perfectly pressed suit rushed forward. "Good evening, sir," the man greeted, tipping his hat with professional precision. Nathaniel nodded but said nothing. He wasn't here for pleasantries. As he walked inside, the scent of fresh lilies and polished wood filled the air. The hotel was immaculate, as expected. The staff moved like clockwork, each employee fulfilling their role seamlessly. At the front desk, the general manager, Victor Langford, rushed forward, visibly nervous. "Mr. Monroe, we weren't expecting you tonight," he said, offering a tight smile. "That's the point," Nathaniel replied coolly, adjusting the cufflinks on his tailored suit. "How are the occupancy rates?" 91%, sir. We've surpassed projections this quarter." Nathaniel nodded, unimpressed. "Good. But our labor costs have increased by 7% compared to last quarter." "Why?" Victor hesitated before responding. "We made some schedule adjustments, sir. Some departments were struggling with." "Fix it." Nathaniel's voice was flat. "We can't afford inefficiency." "Sir, the staff is all ready." "The Monroe name stands for perfection," Nathaniel interrupted. "Perfection requires sacrifice." Victor fell silent, nodding stiffly. Nathaniel knew the man wouldn't argue further. He was, after all, a numbers man himself. As he walked through the hotel, he observed everything through the lens of profit and loss. The pristine towels in the spa, a recurring expense. The concierge team greeting guests with warm smiles, a resource to be optimized. Every interaction, every service, every aesthetic detail, it all had to justify itself financially. It was nearly 1:45 a.m. when Nathaniel decided to make one final sweep of the hotel before retiring to his penthouse suite. The lobby was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the central air conditioning and the rhythmic click of his leather shoes against the polished floor. Then, as he rounded the corner near the guest lounge, he stopped abruptly. On one of the expensive leather sofas, a young woman lay curled up, fast asleep. Her uniform, a crisp navy blue vest over a white button-down shirt, indicated she was hotel staff. Her name tag read Ava Carter. In her lap, an open textbook rested, its pages filled with handwritten notes. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Excuse me," his voice sliced through the silence like a blade. Ova jolted awake, eyes wide with horror as the book tumbled to the floor. "Mr. Monroe, I'm so sorry. Do you make a habit of sleeping on the job?" His voice was cold, his gray eyes sharp as steel. "And no, sir, She scrambled to her feet, smoothing her wrinkled uniform. Her long brown hair had come loose, and deep shadows darkened the skin beneath her eyes. "I was on my break," she stammered. "I must have dozed off." "Your break ended 3 hours ago," Nathaniel cut in, checking his Rolex. Ava's face drained of color. "No, that can't be right. I only sat down for a few minutes to study." "This isn't a library, Miss Carter," he snapped, his expression unreadable. This is a five-star hotel, and our guests expect nothing short of professionalism. I understand, sir. It won't happen again, she whispered, but there was a quiet defiance in her eyes. Nathaniel pressed the intercom button on his phone. Victor, come to the lobby. Now. Within minutes, the general manager arrived, his posture stiff. Sir, Victor asked, glancing at Ava, who stood rigid, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I found your receptionist sleeping on the job, Nathaniel said flatly. Handle it. Victor hesitated. Sir, if I may. Do I look like I'm interested in excuses? Nathaniel's voice held an edge of finality. Ava swallowed hard as Victor nodded, turning to her. Come with me. As Ava gathered her belongings, her hands trembled slightly. She paused, looking up at Nathaniel. Mr. Monroe, she said softly, if I could just explain. Save it for Victor, he dismissed her. Then, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience, he turned on his heel. And make sure that sofa is sanitized before guests arrive. As Victor led Ava away, Nathaniel caught a flicker of something strange in his chest, something he didn't recognize. Shaking it off, he turned to leave. That was when he noticed it. A small notebook had fallen from Ava's pocket. Its pages lay open, revealing carefully written calculations, work schedules, financial breakdowns, and something that caught Nathaniel off guard. Meticulous records of every hour worked, every missing paycheck, every denied overtime request. Nathaniel froze. For a moment, something unfamiliar settled over him. A twinge of doubt. But he shoved it aside. Sentiment was bad for business, and business was all that mattered. Or at least, that's what he thought. The cracks in the foundation. Nathaniel Monroe sat alone in his penthouse suite at the top of the Monroe Regent, a place designed for unparalleled luxury. But tonight, it felt suffocating. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls, a view most would envy. But for the first time in years, he barely noticed. Instead, his eyes were locked on the small notebook in his hands. He had meant to toss it aside, to let Victor handle the mess with the receptionist. But something about it nagged at him. Page after page, Ava Carter had recorded every extra hour worked, every payroll discrepancy, every denied request for overtime pay. Some were her own notes. Most, however, belonged to others. Nathaniel's forehead creased as he read an entry from 2 months ago. James L. Maintenance. Worked 16 hours. Paid for 8. Maria F. Housekeeping. Requested medical leave. Denied. Lucas P. Concierge. Terminated after requesting overtime pay owed for 6 months. Nathaniel sat back, running a hand through his hair. This can't be right. His instinct was to dismiss it. Ava was just a low-level employee, a receptionist with no real power. Surely she had misunderstood something, or worse, was exaggerating. But then he remembered the look in her eyes when she had pleaded to explain herself. Not fear, not defensiveness, something else entirely. Conviction. Nathaniel scrolled through his tablet, pulling up payroll records. They looked perfectly normal. Employees were paid on time, shifts logged correctly, overtime within budget. Yet, something felt off. Numbers don't lie, but people can manipulate them. His phone buzzed. It was Victor. Sir, the matter with Miss Carter has been handled, he said smoothly. Nathaniel hesitated. What does that mean? She's been suspended until further notice. Suspended, not fired. Why? Nathaniel asked. Victor hesitated. I thought it best to tread carefully, sir. She's been with us for 3 years, and some of the staff might react negatively if we terminate her too abruptly. That was interesting. Do you think she's lying? Nathaniel asked. A long pause. Sir, Victor said carefully, I believe Miss Carter is young and inexperienced. She sees numbers but doesn't understand the bigger picture of corporate efficiency. There's a reason we keep labor costs down. Nathaniel frowned. Efficiency doesn't mean cheating employees out of their wages. Of course not, sir, Victor said smoothly. Everything we do is within legal limits. Something in that response bothered Nathaniel. Fine, he said after a moment. Schedule a meeting with her tomorrow at noon. I want to hear her side of this. Sir, that wasn't a request, Victor. Understood. Nathaniel ended the call, setting the notebook down on his desk. The polished surface reflected his own expression, one he barely recognized. For the first time, in a long time, he wasn't sure what to believe. A morning of discontent. The next morning, Nathaniel found himself watching the hotel staff more closely than usual. From a secluded spot in the lobby cafe, he observed the way the employees moved. Their smiles weren't as bright as he once thought. Their conversations, when they thought no one was listening, were tense. The housekeeping staff rushed from one room to another, never pausing for more than a few seconds. The kitchen workers barely spoke, their movements stiff, mechanical. At the concierge desk, a young man in his mid-30s was massaging his wrist as he typed. Nathaniel approached. Everything all right? He asked. The man stiffened. Of course, sir, he said too quickly. Nathaniel didn't press, but as he walked away, he heard another concierge whisper. Careful. They already fired Lucas for complaining. Nathaniel's chest tightened. Lucas, the same name from Ava's notes. Just then, a guest at a nearby table grumbled to his companion. I swear, service isn't what it used to be. Last night, I asked for an extra pillow. Took them an hour. They're probably understaffed, his friend replied. Did you see the front desk? That girl looked like she hadn't slept in days. Nathaniel exhaled sharply. Something wasn't adding up. The meeting. At exactly 12:00 p.m., Ava Carter walked into the executive conference room. She looked composed, but Nathaniel noticed the way her hands fidgeted slightly at her sides. Victor sat to Nathaniel's right, his expression neutral but guarded. Nathaniel gestured to the seat across from him. Miss Carter, please, sit. Ava hesitated before complying. You kept this, she said suddenly, glancing at the notebook on the table. I did, Nathaniel said, folding his hands. Tell me about it. Ava blinked. You want to know? Yes. She studied his face, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. Then, taking a deep breath, she spoke. I started keeping track when I noticed my own hours weren't adding up, she began. Then I realized it wasn't just me. It was everyone. She opened her bag and pulled out printed emails, written complaints, shift logs. Housekeepers are assigned 30 rooms per shift when the industry standard is 15 to 18. The kitchen staff are working 14-hour days without proper breaks. The maintenance team. Miss Carter, Victor interrupted, his tone polite but firm. Employees are free to leave if they are unhappy. Ava's eyes darkened. Leave for what? Another job that treats them the same way. This is their livelihood. They're trapped. Nathaniel frowned, glancing at the documents. Why wasn't any of this brought to my attention before? He asked. Ava let out a short, bitter laugh. Sir, with all due respect, do you even know your employees' names? Do you talk to them beyond making sure the numbers match? Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Victor stepped in again. Mr. Monroe, I assure you, our financials are in perfect order. If you investigate, you'll find that every report has been signed and approved. Nathaniel tapped the notebook on the table. That's what I'm afraid of, Victor. Victor stiffened, but Nathaniel turned back to Ava. You claim that unpaid wages and overwork are widespread, he said carefully. If you had the power to change one thing right now, what would it be? Ava blinked at him, startled by the question. Then, she said softly, listen to them. Silence filled the room. For the first time, Nathaniel didn't have an immediate response, because deep down he knew. He had never really listened at all. The realization. That evening, Nathaniel did something he hadn't done in years. He went through every financial document himself. The numbers still looked right. But now, he knew where to look deeper. Cross-referencing payroll logs with security footage revealed the truth. Employees clocked in for 8-hour shifts but worked 12. Overtime wasn't officially recorded. And worst of all, his signature was on every document. His stomach twisted. He had always prided himself on being a ruthless businessman. But now, he wasn't sure if he was a leader or just another tyrant in a suit. And for the first time in his career, Nathaniel Monroe realized he had a choice to make. The cost of silence. Nathaniel Monroe stood in his penthouse suite, staring at the evidence scattered across the glass table before him. Payroll records, employee complaints, footage timestamps. Every document, every email, every signature bore one undeniable truth. His hotel was thriving at the cost of its workers. And the worst part, his own name was stamped on every page. For years, Nathaniel had measured success by profit margins, occupancy rates, and investor reports. He had built an empire based on precision and calculated efficiency. But he had been blind, willfully blind. A knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts. "Sir," Victor's voice was cautious. "You asked to see me." Nathaniel turned slowly, his gray eyes unreadable. "Come in, Victor." The general manager stepped inside, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit. He moved with the same practiced ease as always, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. Nathaniel picked up one of the payroll reports. "Can you explain this?" Victor barely glanced at it. "Sir, as I've said, everything is within." "Don't." The single word was sharp, colder than ice. Victor hesitated. Nathaniel took a step closer, dropping the file onto the table with a heavy thud. "You've been doctoring the payroll records, haven't you?" Victor's calm mask cracked, just for a second. "Sir, I..." Nathaniel pressed forward. "Overtime is logged but never paid. Employees are working 16-hour shifts, but only receiving compensation for 8. And you told them it was policy." "Mr. Monroe," Victor began carefully, adjusting his tie. "With all due respect, this is how the entire industry operates. You know that. Hotels survive on lean operations. If we start paying for every overtime hour, we lose millions. We can't afford that." Nathaniel stared at him. "No, Victor, you can't afford that. Because if I start digging deeper, I'm going to find exactly where that lost money actually went, aren't I?" Victor's jaw tightened. "I've already checked the accounts," Nathaniel continued. "There's an unaccounted discrepancy of over $4.6 million in labor costs alone. Money that should have gone to my employees." "Your employees?" Victor scoffed. "Since when do you care about them? You're the one who signed off on every single report. If anyone's responsible for this, it's you, sir." The words hit like a hammer. Nathaniel's breath hitched. He wanted to argue, to deny it, to claim he had simply been too busy, that he had trusted Victor to handle it all. But the truth was clear. Victor had orchestrated this. But Nathaniel had let him. And that made him just as guilty. For the first time in years, Nathaniel didn't know what to do. The breaking point. Nathaniel didn't sleep that night. Instead, he walked the hotel's service corridors, the places he had never bothered to visit before. He watched housekeepers scrubbing floors, their backs bent in exhaustion. He saw kitchen staff working past their scheduled shifts, sneaking hurried bites of food in between plating dishes. He overheard maintenance workers joking, not about their paychecks, but about how little sleep they got. And then he saw Ava. She was sitting in a small break room, a cup of cheap coffee in her hands, her shoulders tense with exhaustion. She didn't notice him at first, but when she did, her expression hardened. "Mr. Monroe," she said stiffly. Nathaniel hesitated. Then, instead of ordering or accusing, he simply sat down across from her. She blinked. "Why are you here?" she asked cautiously. Nathaniel exhaled, glancing around the tiny break room, the dim lighting, the rickety chairs, the outdated vending machine half filled with expired snacks. This was where his employees rested. He shook his head. Ava. He paused. Saying the words felt almost foreign to him. I was wrong. Ava's eyes widened slightly. I let this happen, Nathaniel admitted. I let the numbers blind me. I let Victor handle everything while I just assumed things were fine. They weren't, Ava said quietly. I know, he murmured. And I need your help to fix it. Ava studied him carefully. And why should I trust you now? Nathaniel held up the notebook, the one she had kept, filled with records. Because I finally started listening, he said. She stared at the notebook, then at him. For the first time, she didn't look at him with anger. Just cautious hope. A dangerous decision. The next morning, Nathaniel called a mandatory executive meeting. The department heads filed in, murmuring to each other in uncertainty. Victor sat near the front, his face calm but watchful. Nathaniel stood at the head of the table, his hands resting flat against the polished wood. Effective immediately, he announced, the Monroe Regent will be implementing sweeping policy changes. Murmurs rose instantly. All unpaid overtime will be fully compensated, Nathaniel continued. Labor quotas will be adjusted to industry standards, and there will be a full-scale investigation into fraudulent payroll practices. Victor's expression darkened. Sir, one of the finance executives interjected, that will cost us millions. I don't care, Nathaniel interrupted. Silence fell. Victor leaned back in his chair, smirking. Do you know what you're doing? He asked coolly. This is suicide. Our investors. Nathaniel cut him off. I already spoke to them, he said. Some are pulling out. The ones who remain, they support the changes, because this hotel will not be built on exploitation any longer. Victor's smirk vanished. He knew what this meant. His empire was crumbling. Nathaniel turned to security. Escort Mr. Langford off the premises, he ordered. The room gasped. Victor's face turned red. You're making a mistake, Monroe. No, Nathaniel said quietly. I made a mistake trusting you. And now I'm fixing it. Security grabbed Victor's arm. He jerked away, glaring at Nathaniel. You won't survive this, he spat. Nathaniel met his gaze without blinking. Watch me. The door slammed shut behind Victor's exit. Nathaniel turned back to his executives. You have two options, he said evenly. Stay and help me rebuild this hotel the right way, or leave. No one moved. After a long moment, the head of housekeeping stood. I've been waiting for this for years, she said. I'm in. One by one, the others followed. Ava, watching from the doorway, smiled for the first time. A new future. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. Wages were adjusted. Schedules were rebalanced. Overtime was paid. And slowly, the staff began to trust again. One afternoon, as Nathaniel passed the front desk, he saw Ava standing behind it, smiling as she greeted a guest. When she looked up and met his gaze, she nodded in quiet approval. Nathaniel nodded back. For the first time, he wasn't just a businessman. He was a leader. And this time, he would not fail them again. Rebuilding from the ashes, Nathaniel Monroe sat at the head of the conference table, his fingers pressed together in thoughtful silence. The room was full. Department heads, financial officers, HR managers, and Ava Carter, now sitting in on the meeting at his request. She was the youngest person at the table, and yet she had forced this conversation to happen. Nathaniel cleared his throat. Let's get to work. The meeting began in chaos. We can't afford this, the finance director argued. We've already lost 2 major investors. The hotel's reputation is on the line. Another added, public perception is everything. If the press gets hold of the payroll fraud, they will, Nathaniel interjected smoothly. Because we're going to tell them first. The room fell silent. Ava's eyes flickered with surprise. You're going public with it? She asked. Nathaniel nodded. Yes, full transparency. If we hide, we lose credibility. But if we own up to our mistakes, we control the narrative. Instead of a scandal, we turn this into a redemption story. HR shifted uncomfortably. Sir, that could backfire. Everything we've done up to this point has been about maximizing profit, Nathaniel said. We need to start maximizing trust. Ava leaned forward. What about the employees? The ones who lost wages? We're paying them back. Every cent. A stunned hush settled over the table. The finance director paled. That's going to cost us millions. Nathaniel's expression hardened. Then we lose millions. A few executives exchanged glances. You're serious about this, the HR director murmured. Nathaniel met her gaze. I should have been serious about it years ago. Eva tapped her pen against her notepad, her brows furrowed. It's not just about the money. The working conditions need to change too. The housekeepers are overworked. The kitchen staff have been skipping meals. People are scared to even speak up. Nathaniel nodded. We're revising the schedules. Fewer rooms per shift. Mandatory breaks. Paid sick leave. And we'll be implementing a whistleblower protection policy so no one gets fired for speaking out. HR scribbled furiously on her notepad. The kitchen director hesitated. If we give the employees more time off, we're going to need more staff. Nathaniel tapped the tabletop. Then hire more staff. But, no buts. We ran this place like a machine, grinding people into the ground. That stops today. Silence. Then, one by one, the executives nodded. Nathaniel exhaled. Now let's talk about how we roll this out. Ava smiled for the first time. The first real test. A week later, the announcement went public. Nathaniel Monroe stood at a press conference, his hand steadied despite the flashes of camera lights. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, I am here today to acknowledge a failure. The crowd stilled. For years, I ran the Monroe Regent with a focus on efficiency and profit. And in doing so, I ignored the people who made this hotel what it is. A murmur spread through the reporters. In recent weeks, I have discovered that our employees were being overworked, underpaid, and mistreated under the guise of business efficiency. That ends now. He took a breath. As of today, all affected employees will receive full back pay for unpaid hours. We are implementing better working conditions, reducing workloads, and hiring additional staff. A reporter raised a hand. Mr. Monroe, are you saying you had no knowledge of this before? Nathaniel didn't flinch. I should have known. And that's my failure. But I am taking full responsibility now. Another journalist leaned forward. Some investors are pulling out due to these changes. Are you concerned? Nathaniel let out a dry chuckle. Any investor who values profits over people can go. The Monroe Regent will be a hotel of integrity, with or without them. A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. Then, slowly, they applauded. Behind him, Ava stood with the employees, arms crossed. She caught his eye and nodded. For the first time in his career, Nathaniel wasn't chasing money. He was chasing what was right. The fallout. The next few weeks were brutal. Several wealthy clients canceled bookings. A handful of high-profile investors backed out. The media buzzed with speculation. Was this a bold leadership move, or the beginning of Monroe's downfall? But then, something unexpected happened. New investors stepped in, ones who believed in ethical business. Guests who valued fairness started booking stays, praising the hotel for its integrity. The staff, for the first time in years, worked with relief instead of fear. And Nathaniel, he walked the hotel every morning. Not with a clipboard, not checking the efficiency reports, talking to people, learning their names, understanding their lives. And for the first time, the Monroe Regent didn't feel like a machine. It felt like a home. A night in the lobby. One night, after a long shift, Nathaniel walked into the lobby lounge. Ava was sitting on one of the leather couches, her textbook open. He smiled faintly. Déjà vu. She looked up, smirking. I'm actually off the clock this time. He raised an eyebrow. Studying. Yeah, she admitted. Now that I actually have time to breathe, I figured I should finish my hotel management degree. Nathaniel hesitated. You ever think about running your own hotel someday? Ava laughed softly. Maybe. But I'm not in a rush. I actually like it here now. Something warm settled in Nathaniel's chest. He hesitated, then sat down across from her. I never thank you, he said, for pushing me to open my eyes. Ava studied him for a long moment. Then she grinned. Guess even millionaires need a wake-up call sometimes. Nathaniel chuckled. Yeah, I guess they do. The lobby was quiet, except for the soft hum of life moving forward. No fear, no tension, just the peace of something rebuilt the right way. And for the first time in years, Nathaniel Monroe was proud of what he had built. The true measure of success. The Monroe Regent had always been known for its glamour, its gleaming chandeliers, its pristine marble floors, its exclusive penthouse suites that only the world's elite could afford. But now, the hotel was gaining a reputation for something far more valuable: integrity. And that, Nathaniel Monroe realized, was a kind of success he had never considered before. The employees speak up. The staff noticed the changes first. Housekeepers, who once had to race through 30 rooms a shift, were now given reasonable workloads. Kitchen staff, who used to skip meals just to keep up, were now required to take breaks, with free meals provided. For the first time in years, employees were no longer afraid to speak up. Nathaniel made sure of that. One afternoon, he stood in the break room, facing a small crowd of employees who had gathered nervously. Ava stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the exchange carefully. All right, Nathaniel said. Tell me the truth. What do we still need to fix? A long silence followed. Then, slowly, James, one of the maintenance workers, stepped forward. Sir, he hesitated, then sighed. Some of us still don't trust this will last. We've been lied to before. A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. Nathaniel nodded, not offended, but understanding. I get it, he admitted. Trust isn't built overnight. So let's prove it. We're implementing an employee council, representatives from every department. You'll have a say in major decisions. James blinked. Wait, you mean, like, actual input? Exactly, Nathaniel confirmed. No more policies being made behind closed doors. If something isn't working, we'll fix it together. The skepticism was still there, but so was something else. Hope. Ava's promotion. 1 week later, Nathaniel called Ava into his office. She arrived, looking wary. Am I in trouble? She joked, but her voice held a trace of nervousness. Nathaniel smirked. Depends on how you feel about job offers. Ava blinked. I want you to be the hotel's assistant general manager. Her eyes widened. Wait, what? You've been holding this place together long before I noticed, he said. You see what I don't. You challenge what's broken. That's exactly the kind of leadership this place needs. Ava stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Sir, I'm 24. I'm still finishing my degree. And Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. I built this hotel when I was 25. Age doesn't matter. Competence does. And you have it. Ava hesitated. You don't have to decide now, Nathaniel added. Think about it. She sat back in the chair, eyes narrowing. Why me? Because I trust you, he said simply. Ava looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. I'll think about it, she said. But Nathaniel already knew her answer. The final confrontation. Not everyone was happy about the changes, especially Victor Langford. Though he had been fired, the damage he had done ran deep. Late one night, Nathaniel received a call from the legal department. Sir, we have a problem, his lawyer said. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. What now? Victor is threatening a lawsuit. Claims wrongful termination. Says he'll release damaging information about the hotel if we don't settle. Nathaniel exhaled sharply. Victor had always been ruthless, and now he was desperate. Eva found Nathaniel pacing his office later that evening. "You look like you're about to punch a wall," she observed. "I might," he admitted. "Victor is trying to blackmail me." Eva raised an eyebrow. "So, let him. What's he got?" Nathaniel hesitated. "Technically, my signature is on those fraudulent payroll documents," he admitted. "Even though I didn't know what I was signing, I'm still legally liable. If Victor goes public, I could face serious consequences." Eva studied him. "And what are you going to do?" Nathaniel clenched his jaw. "The right thing," he said. He called a press conference the next morning, and in front of the cameras, he did what no one expected. He told the truth. "I take full responsibility for what happened under my leadership," Nathaniel said, voice steady. "Whether I knew about it or not, I was the one in charge. And leaders don't make excuses. They fix what's broken." Victor lost his leverage, and with public trust on Nathaniel's side, the former general manager's lawsuit collapsed before it even began. Nathaniel had built a legacy of power, but now he was building one of integrity. 1 year later, the Monroe Regent had transformed. The staff turnover rate dropped by 75%. Employee satisfaction scores skyrocketed, and for the first time in years, the hotel's guest ratings hit record highs. One afternoon, as Nathaniel walked through the lobby, he overheard a conversation. "Ever since they changed management, this place feels different," a guest said. "In a good way?" her companion asked. "In the best way," she replied with a smile. Nathaniel smiled to himself. At the front desk, Ava stood, no longer a receptionist, but assistant general manager. When she caught his eye, she smirked. "Guess you didn't ruin the hotel after all." Nathaniel chuckled. "Not for lack of trying." Ava crossed her arms. "So what's next?" Nathaniel thought about it. For the first time, he wasn't obsessed with expansion. He wasn't looking for the next profit margin to maximize. Instead, he looked around at his employees, his people. "We keep building," he said. "Not just hotels, but something better." And this time, he knew he was finally on the right path. Legacy rewritten. A year had passed since the fall of Victor Langford and the transformation of the Monroe Regent. And yet, Nathaniel Monroe still found himself awake at 2 a.m., staring out of his penthouse window at the sprawling city skyline. Not from stress, but from purpose. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just running a business. He was building something real, something that mattered. A new reputation. The Monroe Regent had changed in more ways than one. Guests now chose the hotel not just for its luxury, but for its values. Its new slogan, proudly displayed at the entrance, read, "Excellence with integrity." And it wasn't just marketing fluff. It was real. Every employee was paid fairly. Schedules were balanced, and mental health support was added to employee benefits. And for the first time ever, the hotel's profit-sharing program was in effect, meaning that every staff member, from housekeepers to concierges, got a piece of the success. People weren't just working at the Monroe Regent anymore. They were thriving. The boardroom showdown. But not everyone was happy. Nathaniel had angered powerful people, old investors who still saw his policies as financial suicide. And today, they had called a meeting to remind him of it. The boardroom was tense. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table, flanked by Ava Carter, his newly appointed assistant general manager. Across from them sat 3 board members, all seasoned corporate men in their 60s, dressed in expensive suits. One of them, Lawrence Davenport, steepled his fingers. "Nathaniel," he began, "we understand your vision, but we must be honest. These changes, they're costing us millions." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, and the second board member, Gregory Holt, frowned. "And we have a responsibility to our investors," Ava scoffed. You mean the same investors who pulled out when we stopped underpaying workers? Nathaniel smirked. Yeah, forgive me if I don't miss them. Lawrence sighed. Nathaniel, you need to understand. Profitability is key in this industry. We're in a competitive market. The Monroe Regent isn't just competing with itself. It's competing with the entire hospitality sector. Nathaniel slid a folder across the table. Open it. The board members exchanged glances before reluctantly flipping through the pages. Inside were recent financial reports, and not the disaster they expected. Ava smiled. Our profits are up by 23%. Gregory's brow furrowed. How? Nathaniel tapped the file. Happy employees provide better service. Better service creates loyal guests. Loyal guests drive revenue. He leaned forward. We don't need to underpay workers to be profitable. We just need to run smarter. Silence. Then Lawrence sighed, rubbing his temples. And what about expansion? Are we supposed to just focus on one hotel forever? Nathaniel smiled. Who said I'm stopping at one? Ava raised an eyebrow, genuinely intrigued. The board members stared. You're saying? I'm saying I'm taking the Monroe Regent model and applying it to all my hotels. Gregory paled. All of them. Nathaniel nodded. From now on, every hotel under Monroe Hospitality will operate with the same fair policies, ethical pay, and employee-first approach. The boardroom was silent. Then Lawrence laughed, shaking his head. You really are your father's son, aren't you? Nathaniel smiled faintly. Guess I finally learned from him. The men exchanged glances. And one by one, they nodded. Nathaniel had won, not by force, but by proving them wrong. Ava's challenge. Later that evening, Nathaniel and Ava stood in the hotel's rooftop garden, a place he had rarely used before, but now found peaceful. Ava crossed her arms. So, you're really going all in on this? Nathaniel nodded. I didn't come this far to stop halfway. She smirked. You know, when I first met you, I thought you were the worst boss I'd ever had. Nathaniel chuckled. Yeah, I was. She shook her head. And now, you're actually decent. Don't make it weird, he joked. Ava laughed, then turned serious. You're really giving me a lot of responsibility, Nathaniel. Are you sure? He met her gaze. You saved this place before I even realized it needed saving, he said. There's no one else I'd trust more. Ava exhaled, then nodded. All right, let's change the industry. Nathaniel grinned. Let's. The guest who changed everything. 1 week later, a mysterious guest checked into the Monroe Regent. She was in her 60s, elegant but understated, with piercing hazel eyes and a presence that commanded attention. Nathaniel noticed her as she stood in the lobby, observing the staff. He approached. Good evening, he greeted. Nathaniel Monroe. Welcome to the Monroe Regent. The woman smiled. I know who you are. He raised an eyebrow. Do we know each other? In a way, she said. I'm Margaret Hastings. Nathaniel's stomach dropped. Margaret Hastings was one of the most powerful hospitality executives in the country, the CEO of a major luxury hotel chain. I've been hearing about your changes, she said, and I had to see them for myself. Nathaniel folded his arms. And Margaret looked around. The way the staff smiled, the way guests were genuinely enjoying their stay, the way the energy of the hotel had changed. Then she turned back to him. I want to make you an offer. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. What kind of offer? Margaret smiled. I want you to bring your model to my hotels. Ava, standing nearby, nearly choked on her coffee. You want to partner with us? Nathaniel asked, shocked. Margaret nodded. The hospitality industry is changing. People don't just want luxury anymore. They want ethics, transparency, leadership, and you've proven it works. Nathaniel exhaled. That's a big move. Margaret shrugged. You've already changed one hotel. Now, Let's change the world. Nathaniel looked at Ava, who just grinned. Guess we're not stopping at one hotel, huh? She teased. Nathaniel laughed. Not even close. The future begins. That night, as Nathaniel stood on the rooftop garden, he thought about how far things had come. A year ago, he had been blind to the truth. Now, he was rewriting an industry, and for the first time in his life, this was the legacy he wanted to build. With people, with purpose, and with a hotel that finally lived up to the name Monroe. And he was just getting started. The legacy that lasts. 1 year later, a new empire. The Monroe Regent stood taller than ever, not just as a symbol of luxury, but as a beacon of change in the hospitality industry. What had once been just another 5-star hotel was now the model for ethical business practices. And the man at the center of it all. Nathaniel Monroe. A man who had once measured success in profits, now measured it in people. But tonight, as he walked through the hotel's glowing lobby, he knew this was just the beginning. Because what had started as a single hotel's transformation had now spread across the entire industry. The turning point. It had started with Margaret Hastings' offer. After months of negotiations, Margaret's hotel chain, Hastings International, had officially partnered with Monroe Hospitality. Their shared goal: to rewrite the rulebook of the hotel industry. Gone were the days of exploited workers and greedy investors controlling everything. Now, they were proving that treating employees fairly wasn't just ethical, it was profitable. And the numbers spoke for themselves. Employee retention had increased by 87% across all Monroe hotels. Guest satisfaction scores were at an all-time high. Major investors who once doubted Nathaniel were now scrambling to get back on board. But Nathaniel wasn't interested in short-term gains anymore. He was building something that would last. The Hotel Summit Showdown. The Hospitality Leadership Summit was one of the most important events of the year, bringing together the most powerful hotel executives from across the world. And this year, Nathaniel Monroe was the keynote speaker. As he stepped onto the grand stage, hundreds of executives, journalists, and investors turned their attention to him. A year ago, they had dismissed him as a reckless businessman who had ruined his own empire. Tonight, they were hanging on his every word. Nathaniel adjusted the microphone, his gray eyes scanning the crowd. A year ago, he began, I stood at the head of a hotel that was making record-breaking profits. Silence fell. But what I failed to see, he continued, was that those profits were built on exploitation. Some of the executives shifted uncomfortably. I let efficiency take priority over people. I let my leadership become detached, and worst of all, he exhaled. I thought that was just how business worked. A murmur spread through the crowd. Nathaniel smiled slightly. But then, I woke up. He turned to the massive screen behind him, where slides of data flashed. These numbers, he said, pointing, prove that treating employees with respect, fair wages, and balanced work schedules isn't just good ethics. It's good business. The old-school executives frowned, but the new generation of leaders, they were listening. We're here today to talk about the future of hospitality, Nathaniel continued. And I'm telling you right now, the future is in putting people first. The crowd erupted in applause. And just like that, everything changed. Back at the Monroe Regent, the day after the summit, Nathaniel returned to the Monroe Regent, where his employees greeted him like family. In the past, his arrival would have been met with nervous tension. Now, people actually smiled when they saw him. How was the speech, boss? James, the maintenance worker, called out. Nathaniel smirked. I think I scared a few people. James laughed. Good. They needed it. Nathaniel continued his walk, taking in the vibrant energy of the hotel. At the front desk, Ava stood, managing a last-minute VIP request, while also answering an email. Assistant General Manager Carter, Nathaniel greeted. She didn't even look up. CEO Monroe, she shot back, typing furiously. Nathaniel chuckled. Big morning, he asked. She exhaled, finally glancing up at him. VIP guests. New hires starting today. Oh, and the Hastings team is flying in for their final staff training session. Nathaniel nodded. That's a lot. Ava smirked. We're building an empire, remember. No time to slow down. He shook his head, amused. You know, you're way too good at this. That's why you hired me, she said. Nathaniel was about to respond when an excited voice interrupted. Mr. Monroe. He turned, and his expression softened. A young housekeeper, Maria, approached, holding a college acceptance letter in her hands. I got in, she said breathlessly. I start classes in September. Nathaniel smiled. Maria, that's incredible. She nodded rapidly. I wouldn't have been able to do it without the Employee Education Fund. I just wanted to say, thank you. Ava nudged Nathaniel. See, you're not so bad after all. He chuckled, watching Maria return to her colleagues, who were cheering for her. This was what it was all about. Not profits, not investor meetings, but real lives, real people. Nathaniel exhaled, looking around the hotel he had nearly lost because of his own blind ambition. Now, it was thriving. And it wasn't just the Monroe Regent anymore. It was the future of hospitality. Eva crossed her arms. All right, CEO. What's next? Nathaniel smiled. Now, he glanced toward the city skyline, where new opportunities awaited. Now we take this model global. Ava's eyes widened. You mean? Nathaniel nodded. We're expanding. New hotels, new cities, same mission. Ava grinned. Guess I should clear my schedule. Nathaniel chuckled. Yeah, you probably should. Because this was just the beginning of a new kind of business, a new kind of leadership, a legacy that truly mattered. And this time, Nathaniel Monroe would get it right. Final scene, the rooftop garden. That night, Nathaniel stood on the hotel's rooftop garden, watching the city lights stretch into the horizon. A year ago, he had stood here, unsure of what kind of leader he wanted to be. Now, he knew. The Monroe Regent had become something greater than just a luxury hotel. It had become a movement. And as long as he was in charge, that movement would never stop growing. Eva joined him, handing him a glass of whiskey. To the future, she asked, raising her glass. Nathaniel smirked. To the future. They clinked glasses, the city lights twinkling around them. And in that moment, Nathaniel knew. This was only the beginning. And he was ready for whatever came next.